learning so far with you. So I'll now hand over to Collaborate, who will guide us through today's session.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you. My name's Ellen Kerr. I'm Head of Practice at Collaborate, and I've been working with Kirsty and Jill and others at the BSA over the last year or so on the Ideas Fund infrastructure work. As Kirsty said, we're really keen that this session is an opportunity kind of for creating connections within and beyond people doing this work. So we've created a really short survey in SurveyMonkey that you can complete to tell us about the work you're doing to nurture healthy systems, what other examples across the country and internationally you think we should be looking at and learning from, and what questions you're interested in exploring with others doing similar work. So it would be great if you could take a moment at some point in the session to respond to the poll and share your responses. We put the link into chat there, and there's also a QR code on the screen here, so you can scan that on your phone if that's easier. And everything that we receive, we're going to collate and share after the session with everybody who's joined. So there's an option there to leave your name and contact details if you're happy for those to be shared. And we'll also dip into some of the responses later on in the session. Don't feel you need to do this survey right this second. It might be that as the discussion about what nurturing a healthy system looks like kind of goes on, you get more a sense of the work you'd like to share, but it would be great if you could do it at some point today. So before we get into hearing from our exciting guest speakers, I'm going to give a bit of a brief introduction to frame why it is we're talking about systems and why this idea of going beyond projects to nurture healthy systems is important to us. Projects is probably a word that we're quite familiar with, but systems can be one of those words that we use a lot but don't always define. So I thought perhaps it would be helpful to start with some definitions. I really like this definition that comes from Donella Meadows. She tells us that a system is a set of things, people, cells, molecules, or whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. And one of the reasons I like this quote so much is that there's so many important ideas nested into it. The first half of the quote is quite easy to understand. A system is a set of things, but we can draw a distinction between just a collection of things like tools in a toolbox or a kitchen or a database of names, and a system, which would be a football team, a toaster, or a marriage. This is because the second part of the statement is crucial too, that a set of things is interconnected, working together or in tension to produce the outcomes that they produce. And why things get even more interesting is that those outcomes, those patterns of behavior over time that the system is producing, are a natural consequence of the way that the system is set up. So two things to note there. One is that systems produce the outcomes, not the parts of the system, but the whole. It's not the carburetor or the spark plugs or the gasket, but how they come together as an engine that makes the car go. And the second is the notion that a particular system is optimized to produce the outcomes that it produced. It produces the results it does because that's what it's configured to do. It might have been designed that way, like the car engine, but also the system could have just evolved that way to be the way it is, a product of a million different adaptations across millennia or different political and social choices over decades or even centuries. It doesn't matter whether it's kind of deliberate or evolving, the system will still produce the results that the system is configured to produce. Many of the systems we're dealing with are much more complex than car engines. We consider systems or issues to be complex when there are lots of different actors and factors interacting in unpredictable ways, resulting in different outcomes for different people at different times. Take, for example, this map of a complex system around well-being. This lists just some of the actors and factors that interact to impact on an individual's well-being. So actors include the person themselves, their family, the people who run green spaces or cultural or sporting provision where they live, health services, welfare agencies, and emergency services. And then on the right-hand side in the purple, you can see factors like their income, their employment status, their housing, as well as the extent to which they're part of marginalized or dominant cultures that has a bearing on how they experience their world and their well-being. What this map is demonstrating is that the outcome of individual well-being is not within the control of any one actor or intervention in the system. It's dependent on the interconnections between them, and it will look different for every different person. So how do we respond in the face of this complexity? I really like this quote from Dr. Harry Scher from the University of Bath, who said, "I was asked recently to name the single most important intervention to reduce childhood obesity. My weary reply," you can imagine he gets asked this quite a lot, "is that the single most important intervention is to understand that there is no single most important intervention. Just like there's no single cause to a complex problem, there's no single intervention that can solve it. So if we want to understand how to support an outcome, we need to understand and influence the behavior of these complex systems. To enable long-lasting, sustainable change that addresses the root causes that are really going to address a problem for the longer term, we need to think about how to change the system that is producing the outcomes." And systems change is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. Lots of people are talking about it. Lots of people are saying that's what they're doing and that's what their focus is. But it's actually really hard to find one agreed definition of what systems change is. And one that I've always found helpful, partly because I can actually remember it, is one from FSG, who talk about systems change as advancing equity by shifting the conditions holding a problem in place. So that's drawing a distinction between change that addresses kind of the symptoms and what we see on the surface level, and change that's addressing the underlying conditions that are keeping that problem from resurfacing and keeping it from coming up all the time. But what sorts of things do they mean by those underlying conditions? Well, they created this great model, this inverted triangle, which is similar to things like the iceberg model that you might have come across as well. But I think it really helps us to kind of dig deeper into what we mean by systems change and how to think about the conditions. And if in FSG's version of this model, there's 6 things arranged into 3 different levels. At the top level, the things that are perhaps the most obvious, even if they're still difficult to change. So policies, practices, and resources. And often kind of the project work that we're doing is sitting at this level. It's about trying to change some of those things or work across some of those things to have an impact. On the next level down are things that might be a bit harder to see. So this is where you have to really be observing the system carefully to understand the relationships between things within them, the power dynamics. It's about asking questions around who is really making decisions around here, which voices are heard and which are excluded, which communities are attracting the resources at the top level or shaping the policies, and why is it them, not someone else? So these things are harder to see, but more fundamental for those trying to change systems. And finally, at the bottom are those kind of mental models, the glasses that we're all wearing when we look out and see the world. The systems we live in shape just not our organizations and our work, but the individual choices we make and what we believe is possible. Even our freest choices are conditioned by the way that we see the world. And this can be hard to see, the mental models, a bit like a fish in the water who doesn't know that they're wet. You don't necessarily, it's hard to kind of say what your mental model is or how it's filtering the way that you see the world. So sometimes it's easiest to kind of notice them by looking back at history, where we can observe more clearly how a mental model framed a set of societal choices. So about the role of women and the fact that at some point we all thought it made sense that only one gender could vote and the other couldn't, or that the slave trade was a legitimate way to make money in our country. So these mental models, they can be really hidden and often the hardest to change, but also where the most transformative change happens if we're able to shift some of those mental models. So much of the systems work that we do to collaborate with our partners who come from all different sectors is about trying to work at these different levels to nurture healthy systems. And I'll share some specific examples in just a second, but just want to emphasize what we mean by healthy and unhealthy systems. So an unhealthy system would be one which makes it harder to achieve those goals or steer towards those outcomes that we're hoping for. They're systems that are siloed, competitive, or fragmented. Whereas a healthy system can make it easier to achieve the goals and outcomes we'd hope for, because they have trusting relationships, that shared purpose, they listen to and involve local people in decision-making, and they're constantly learning and adapting. So increasingly, we see funders and commissioners looking beyond only resourcing projects to also pay attention to that wider system and thinking about how they can nurture the health of that system. One example of this is Save the Children's Early Learning Communities programme, which aimed to improve early learning outcomes for children growing up in poverty by changing the way local organisations work together and with families. This work was initiated in 2018 in 4 different locations across England and Wales, and the ELCs brought together people and organisations from across different sectors in a local place to understand the needs of local families, learn how to work effectively together, and make lasting shifts in behaviour and structures to enable that longer term change. Collaborate operated as a learning partner to the Early Learning early learning communities, and we developed this systems change maturity model. And I know there's lots of words on this slide, so don't worry that it won't be possible to read them all now. We can share some links to a bit more detail about this work if people are interested. But what the model, the maturity model, was doing was trying to draw out some of the key underlying conditions that are foundations of a healthy system. So things like the shared vision and purpose across different actors, shifting power to families, trusted collaborative relationships, aligning and coordinating the use of resources, and a culture of learning that enables adaptation. And by developing these conditions, it would create a healthier system that is more likely to support improved outcomes for children and families. So our work was focused on helping them to understand to what extent these conditions were developing and appearing in their place. Another example that we've also been working on recently is with East Sussex County Council and other partners to develop a systems approach to tackling loneliness. We know that alleviating loneliness requires there to be social infrastructure that enables people to connect with others in a way that works for them. And to connect a more creative county where the conditions are in place for people to be able to better connect with each other, the different parts of the system need to be better connected. So this slide shows part of a model that we developed to set out what that could look like in practice. This part illustrating how the different layers within the system and how they're connected one to another. And then there were other parts of this model that kind of set out the activities that might help to deepen and form more of those connections. To tackle loneliness and create connection, action is needed at all of these different layers or levels, not just at one or two. And as with any model, this is a simplification. It's in reality, not everything fits neatly into layers, or the boundaries between layers are more blurred, and there are some actors and activities that actually sit across multiple layers. But models like this can help by being a lens through which we can view the system and think about a way forward, rather than the kind of definitive analysis or a moment of truth that stays fixed forever. So then there's our work with the BSA and the Ideas Fund, which we've been really enjoying over the last year. As we heard from Kirsty, the BSI's hypothesis was that intervening to strengthen different parts of the public engagement system in a place, in addition to funding specific projects that are allowing communities and researchers to come together to do work together, by having both of those things together, it will lead to more meaningful and sustainable public engagement. So we developed this draft framework, and again, apologies for teeny tiny text, but we'll post a link to a more detailed version in the chat so you can have a better look there. But what it does, it sets out indicators of a healthy local public engagement system. And we created this based on interviews and some brief desk research, with a view to really using it to widen our lens about how to increase public engagement in research and identify underlying factors and different ways to intervene that can contribute to longer term change. So the framework's not intended to be a checklist to cross off. We don't expect people to kind of work through and say, we need a one of these and a one of these and a one of these. And we know every place is going to be different. We wouldn't expect every area, every local place to have all the indicators present, or to be starting from the same point, or for them all to have equal importance to them. But we tried to think about the indicators that researchers and universities might look for, that communities and community groups might look for, independently, but also what was needed in common between them. So particularly having shared goals, relationships, behaviours, infrastructure and funding, as well as thinking about that yellow blob, the kind of wider context that they're all operating in, which is not necessarily within the control of those actors, but nonetheless, it often wields significant influence in terms of being an enabler or a constraint on what can be done. So over the last year, we've been working with the Ideas Fund places to apply the framework in practice and gather learning. As places were developing their applications for the infrastructure funding work, we work with them to use the framework to diagnose specific strengths and challenges within their local system, again, recognising that every place is different and that we want to start from where they are in their context, and then think about where they wanted to focus their efforts for change and how they could make building some of these conditions part of the work that they were going to do together collaboratively in the next couple of years. And since then, as the work has been underway, we've been using the framework to kind of capture learning and think about where we might go next, and what the make a plan, a kind of emerging plan for the future. So I'm conscious that that was a lot of me talking and quite a lot of theory to take in on what is nearly Tuesday lunchtime. So I'm going to stop there. I can see Sophia and Dawn have posted various other little bits and pieces into the chat. If there are any sort of specific questions about anything that I've said there, do feel free to post that into the chat. But I think perhaps the best way to really dig into this is to get into kind of thinking about what this really looks like in practice. And to help us do that, I'm really delighted to welcome our guest speakers who have been immersed in this world for some time and have lots to share about how it looks and feels to do this work. So we're joined by Dr. Jill Hughes from the University of Hull and Kate MacDonald, who's director at Tynebank Hull and East Riding. And they are the development coordinators, the joint coordinators for the BSA Ideas Fund in Hull. So I've been working alongside the projects, but also the infrastructure and systems work that the BSA have been doing in Hull for a number of years now. And also really pleased to be joined by Katie Rutherford, who's Director of Insight and Innovation at Norfolk Community Foundation and who leads the community research work at NCF, including work funded by the UKRI's Community Research Networks, which Kirsty made reference to at the start, is a kind of similar sort of approach coming from a slightly different angle. So they're each going to give a bit of an introduction to themselves and their works. We've been those horrible facilitators who've asked them to try and do that in about 5 minutes. So there will be lots left unsaid, but then my colleague Dawn will be kind of opening up some questions to them, and we'll also have an opportunity to open up to wider questions from the audience. So please do post your questions into chat and we'll take it from there. I think I'm passing over to Katie to introduce yourself first.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks so much, Ellen, and hi everyone. It's so nice to be with you today. So as Ellen said, I'm Katie. I'm Director of Insight and Innovation at Norfolk Community Foundation. For those who don't know us, we're one of 47 community foundations across the UK, and we effectively connect people who want to give, and that might be money, time, or insight, with local causes that matter to them. And a big part of that is our grant making, and we grant fund around 2,000 or more community organisations every year. Since I joined the foundation a year ago, we've really been increasing our focus on community research and insight. And we really want to unlock the wealth of knowledge and insight that exists within local communities, to give them the opportunity to really have power and agency over what happens in their local area. And we want to do that both for ourselves and our own funding programmes within the Community Foundation, but also we hope to influence wider change across the system with partners in academia and in statutory services, but also more broadly. And I guess if I had one big aim, it's that when services want to take decisions about funding or service design, they don't just look at the quant data. They also really respect that knowledge and insight that's generated within communities and respect that data on an equal footing with the quant. And so a real big enabler for us in all of this work has been our participation in the UKRI funded research, Community Research Network programme. The opportunity to be part of the programme came up in my first 2 weeks at the Community Foundation, which was just incredible timing and really sat incredibly well with what we were hoping to achieve and what I really wanted to do within my role. The focus of the programme is on building capability and expertise in community-led forms of research and innovation. The programme is effectively run in 2 parts. So the first part, we had to submit an expression of interest to explain how we would want to go about developing a really detailed plan for a community research network in our area. And we were one of 25 collaborations funded nationally to take part in the expression of interest phase, which in total should last around a year. And at the end of that year of kind of testing and learning and collaborating, we have the opportunity to bid into what UKRI call the implementation stage of the programme, which offers more significant funding over much longer time periods. And I think that's a really incredibly exciting opportunity. I've had the opportunity in the past to work on various grant programmes and really learned about how it takes a long time to sort of achieve true system change. And so I think the way that UKRI have approached it is really powerful and exciting. So within our Norfolk network, we're currently focusing on two main areas. So the first one is building collaborations and seeking to really map and understand what's going across the system, so that we understand how we can grow this work over the longer term. And on a recent call, one of the other CRNs called this networking the networks, which I thought was quite a neat description. But we've also wanted to ground our work in the true practice of doing community-led research. So our partners within our community research network are two community organisations based in Norfolk. We're working with an organisation called The Feed, which is a social enterprise based in Norwich, which runs a social supermarket, but also does a lot of community-based work to support people into employment. And we're also working with Shrublands Community Centre, which is a small, very vibrant community centre over in Gorleston on the east coast of Norfolk. And in both those cases, the teams have been recruiting numbers of peer researchers and supporting them to design and carry out community research that matters to them. And we're really seeing that very quickly influencing the practice and services and programmes of those community organisations. So that's been really exciting. But all of this work, we've tried to root it in an asset-based community development approach. And a brilliant enabler of the UKRI funding has been enabled for us as a whole team, including our peer researchers, to undertake asset-based community development training with an organisation called Nurture Development. Some of you may have come across Cormac Russell, who's kind of the godfather of ABCD in the UK and Ireland. And it was an incredible programme and really helped us to focus on starting with what's strong and the assets in the local area, rather than always focusing on needs and potentially what's wrong. The programme has also been an enabler and helped to open doors to our involvement in other programmes and projects. So there's a programme funded by NHS England called the Research and Engagement Network Development Programme, which is very catchy, or REND, which is all about involving communities that don't currently participate in health research to have more equitable access and support to become involved. But we've also increasingly been commissioned by our statutory partners to carry out community research on their behalf to help shape their services or their strategies. And a really brilliant programme we were involved in recently was doing some community-based research to help shape the next 5-year strategy for adult social services in Norfolk, which is a real brilliant opportunity. And having previously worked in the county council, I was so encouraged to see that they were taking such a collaborative community-based approach. So I've been trying to sort of think about how we can sum up all this work in a neat way, and I'm not sure we can, but I'll have a go. So I think essentially it's about creating the conditions for long-term change. And in this, we're acting, I think, in 3 main ways. So firstly, acting as connectors, so connecting disparate and potentially disconnected bits of system change work and helping them to make sense together. I think we've acted as conveners, so bringing people together around a common goal and really kind of focusing on how we can share power within the system and respect and value the assets that we all bring to the table in this work, but also acting as translators, so between the formal system, academia, the voluntary and community sector and small community groups. I wouldn't claim in any way to be an expert in this, and in fact I don't think there are experts in this field, and that's one of the exciting things about it. Everyone is an expert in one way or another. We're all bringing something to the table. What we've seen this as is a real learning journey for us. I think we're constantly questioning ourselves to think about, are we doing this the right way? Is there more we can learn? And that kind of curiosity and questioning has led to even more conversations across the system. And we're looking now to think about how can we share our assets and our knowledge in a really active way. And so that's going to be a big focus for our work over the next 6 months of the Community Research Network programme. So that's us in 5 minutes. I hope it's given you a bit of an overview, but really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Kate and Jill, I'm just going to pop up your slides and then over to you.
Okay, shall we start?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, I think actually we could echo most of what Katie said in terms of the way that we sort of like to work. Kate and I have worked together for a long time, both weavers and connectors, both passionate about systems change and needs-led and participatory approaches. We want to sort of encourage more collaboration because lots of things happen in silos, and I think that's one of the most difficult things about systems change when people are working sort of in their own aspect of this. So I've been at the university for 26 years, always around community and voluntary sector learning, and this has been really sort of important to me. I've banged on about these approaches for a long time, and what's happened really since the Ideas Fund has created the opportunity for us to start to look at how we can do things differently. So you'll see on the slide a little blue couch. That's the Whole We Want couch. And we had a community project which Kate and myself were involved in, where we talked to local people about needs and dreams, and we sort of asked people what their visions for the future were and recognise the big issues that people are facing. And these big issues will only really be dealt with if we can sort of work together. We can shift and share power and work on how best to change the systems that will then be appropriate for everybody to sort of flourish. And Kate will talk a lot more about the sort of systems change aspects of this. And within this, we then got involved with the Poverty Truth Commission because they were invited us along because they could see how we were engaging with communities. And this again has been a really important change. Kate is one of the facilitators with the community and civic commissioners, where they're looking at the issues of poverty together and creating solutions. And this again is creating systems change already within the City Council. And at the same time, we had a contact from the Ideas Fund to see if Hull would be a suitable area to sort of operate in. And we were really excited to say that it was, and we have been. We've been working together. We now have 20 projects in the city that are doing some amazing things. We had a showcase recently that sort of demonstrated really the benefits of this more relational and trusting approach that we've been able to create. We refer to it as a flipped university model because obviously universities are very traditional. It starts with the funder telling people what theme to look at, the academics interpret it, and then they go out and ask communities to get involved. And that's often tokenistic and extractive. So the Ideas Fund is very different. It's relational. It starts with the community. They lead the ideas. And this is where we could sort of really make major changes. It stops the idea of the academic expert telling communities what they need, and it's the communities that are actually recognising what's important. This will create more impact because it's doing things that people actually need and want. So could hopefully create more sustainability within this. But of course, it's been quite a challenge to work within a university to bring together the research and the community. Neither really initially knew what the other could offer. So we had to do quite a lot of work around sort of demystifying what the possibilities were. But we've also come up against systems. You can imagine there are a lot of systems within universities. It's a big bureaucracy. But we've been really fortunate because we've worked with the Knowledge Exchange and Research Innovation Offices, and they've really supported this. When I've gone to them and said the contracts aren't really fit for purpose in working with communities because the communities are hosting the funding, so we need to change those. So we've been able to do that and get out a lot of the jargon. We're working on changing the ethics because that hasn't been appropriate either, and we've enabled the community to also discuss the ethics process, which is usually sort of an academic area of sort of focus. And we're also looking at IP, intellectual property right and co-ownership of data and all the different sort of trials and tribulations that only sort of unfold when you start to do something differently and change the system. These have also led us into a more civic role as well, and the use of the narrative of the Ideas Fund in various different bids, like the Yorkshire Policy Engagement Research Network and Yorkshire Policy Innovation Partnerships are two of the main ones that we've sort of been working with recently, which are trying to engage from a community perspective in how we can develop inclusive growth. And also using the narratives in other bids from the university, because there is a real commitment at Hull to want to change. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Kate at that point.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? My internet did just drop out for a bit, yeah. Okay, yeah, so sort of building on this, I don't know if Jill said at the beginning, but like we sort of identify ourselves as weavers, and I guess that's what this slide is doing. It's demonstrating how we're always sort of got our eyes out looking for opportunities to connect at those intersection points of like shared work, shared values. So just adding to some of there's one project that it was initiated in Hull. It was called Control Shift, and this is about creating the conditions for equitable spaces to shift power, to meet as humans, and also to feel the system that we're part of. So there's something within this around how the systems that we have, you know, like limited by funding, particular roles and everything, that impact on people seeing a bigger picture. So we're sort of finding opportunities where we can experiment with people feeling themselves as part of that. So one of the things that we were doing something called systemic constellations, where people were taking on roles of different parts of the system. And another really exciting thing that we're doing coming up in November is a process called Town Anywhere. So something that's often missing when we're trying to, we know something's not working, but like how do we move beyond tweaking what's there to actually moving into a space of looking at the bigger picture of like what is a flourishing life in the context of planetary boundaries as well. So Town Anywhere, we're bringing 250 people together. This is part of our infrastructure funding to actually time travel into the future to imagine what that flourishing life would be in the context of everything that we live in. So like, how could we reimagine higher education, reimagine what a good community would be, what would our economic system look like? So that feels really exciting, and then harnessing that to actually look at then how do we start working on this? So with these sort of experiments of bringing people together, it's actually bringing people together as like their human being selves over their role selves. So how, and I think that's something that's really come into the ideas funding, connecting the grassroots communities and the academics as well, is it's like enabling people to build relationships that go beyond the particular roles and boxes that we can put each other in, and then enables the othering or sort of jumping to conclusions about things. So this very much links into the sort of asset-based community development and looking at people's strengths and knowledge and interests, but like ultimately enabling through those relationships to open up different conversations, create more of an equitable space, and enable us to move into a place of compassion, reciprocal compassion and curiosity, which in itself moves us into a different direction of actually looking at what are the solution and what are our individual parts in that. So this whole thing about a system, the earlier slide, it was talking about a system, it's like all the molecules. Someone said to me today, as a result of doing the sort of constellations, he feels more comfortable being, he is one molecule in this sort of society and the planet and everything, and he feels more confident about doing his bit within that in collaboration with each other. And I sort of reflected on this a bit, because it's like, if you become more than one molecule, is that cancer? It's like, so it's something about how we work together and create the conditions to do that. So just moving on to the next slide quickly, I just find this a really useful sort of pictorial sort of thing to explain or to consider what we're doing. So it's the Buchanan Institute's two loops theory. So the blue loop, this is like the sort of dominant system that is maybe working for less and less people, and it's like, how do we transition into this sort of, through an emergent process, into different ways of doing things. So within that, you've got, it's not chucking the baby out with the bathwater, it's like looking at the stabilizers, what works within that current system, but what also needs hospicing and composting to enable the conditions for this new way of working to develop. And the orange line, that's very much what we're doing, is it's looking at those networks across sort of different organizations, statutory bodies, like communities, individuals, and then connecting them. And within the Ideas Fund, of course, we have communities of practice that are these spaces that enable that ongoing iterative learning that people have really, you know, we're so much focused on outputs and outcomes. This is the sort of nugget that is so different about the Ideas Fund, that enables this sort of reflective and equitable space to actually be curious and to explore what's working, what's not working, how we can learn from each other, and shift. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Katie, Jill and Kate. That was brilliant. I don't know how you managed to fit so much in 5 minutes, but that was such a great introduction. And also the commonalities, the synergies across both of what we said. Really looking forward to digging in further. So what we're going to do now is have a bit of a panel discussion, informal panel discussion, if we can also spotlight Katie as well. And then we'll invite some audience questions as well. So have a think, what's coming up for you? What are the questions on your mind? And we're also pulling through some of the responses from the survey as well. So please do keep filling that in. So there was so much in what you all said to pick up on, but I suppose one of the things that really jumped out to me was the language you were using about connecting, weaving, and also in our work at Collaborate, including the Save the Children work and East Sussex work that Ellen mentioned, we kind of often talk about system stewardship, meaning the same thing. So people who explicitly try to nurture a healthy system, looking beyond organisational and project boundaries and thinking about how do we build the conditions for long-term change. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your roles. What does it look like in practice for you, and what does it require of you to play that weaving role? Katie, can I come to you first?
Of course. So I think one thing for me is it's about a lot of conversations. So over the last year, I've kind of lost track of how many people I've spoken to across Norfolk that are doing some form of this kind of work. And so I guess what's been incredibly helpful about having some funding to do this, to sort of support us to have the time to do this, is that it's given me license to spend lots of time going out and sort of stimulating those conversations. It's also given a starting point for that. So rather than just going and saying, I'm from Norfolk Community Foundation, I'm interested in community research, I've been able to say, we're doing this in a focused way. You know, we're aiming towards something. This is a long-term goal for us. This is important. And so people have wanted to kind of come on board. And I think people have recognised the value of the approach we're taking by involving our community partners as well. So it isn't just something for one single organisation. It's truly involving the community and understanding how to do this in practice. I think the other thing about the role is really, I mentioned about being a translator. That seems to come up a lot. There's still a tendency, particularly I find with academics and with our statutory partners, to sometimes talk in a different kind of language that isn't always particularly accessible. It can be, I don't know whether off-putting is the word, but it can sort of be a bit exclusionary for people. And so I think there's been a role for me and other members of the team at NCF to kind of do some translation in both directions, and just really just get it down to what we're actually talking about. What's important here. We don't, doesn't need to be anything fancy about this. Let's just talk about what this really means and what's the end result we're aiming for and how we're going to go about doing this together.
Thanks, Katie. That's really, really helpful, that translation piece. And also, I think what you said about license is so important. It is actually quite rare to have the space to play these kind of roles, even though we know they're incredibly valuable. And Jill and Kate, can I come to you? What does weaving mean to you? What does it require of you in your roles?
Shall I go first? Yeah. Yeah, I guess I was sort of thinking about that, just that there's something about having a wide-angled lens on, so it's almost like having eyes in the back of your head, so you're always sort of looking at opportunities to connect. And I think something that I've learned to value over the years is like actually holding the space for conversations that enable emergence. So there's something in there around those sort of circle spaces that enable everyone to speak and wait for synergies as well. So like listening for things that connect to their work and everything, and then start looking at connections and everything. But I think that wide-angled lens it's like, how can we connect to that's something that connects to that, so it becomes more than a sum of its parts by connecting it as well. I think another challenge is a challenge in terms of talking to people is like, because we're in a world that is so focused on like outputs and outcomes, valuing these sort of spaces for reflection, that's I think that's something with the Ideas Fund that we're exploring, how we demonstrate that impact down the line, that sort of more creative and flexible space, but then also having those conversations where you're sort of practicing deep listening. It enables this thing, you know, when we're talking about the different parts of the whole and the molecules within a system and everything, it enables that conversation itself to become its own organism. So there's something beautiful in that, so solutions present itself. But in spaces where people are feeling overwhelmed, it's like that invitation to come into the spaces that can be quite challenging. But I think when you can get people there, it's a very beautiful thing I'm seeing with the Ideas Fund, like how people are like actually going, God, this is a space that is nurturing to me as well. So I think we need to, like, you know, the pressures of being in roles and everything, it's like how can we come into the space of like human to human, and that curiosity and compassion thing is so important within that. So people within a system, like within a statutory body, the duty of care, you know, many people trying to do things under huge challenges and everything. People in communities, we've been sort of like groomed almost to be into like, you're supposed to do this. It's like, how do we enable the unlearning and bringing people together to say we can do this alongside each other?
Thanks, Kate. Jill, did you want to add anything to that?
It's hard to add really, because most of the things have been said by both of them. But I think one of the key things is time, because I think one of the barriers is that people have the everyday to contend with. You know, a lot of communities are sort of focused on the cost of living and having to deal with all the difficult things that people are coming to them with. So it's about being able to see beyond that and affording that space. And as Kate says, once you can get into that space, then I think people can start to see that we could do something differently, which would actually enable us to do things better, or even for less cost. Sometimes a lot of the solutions don't have to cost a lot of money, but it's having the time to sit back and to do that, but finding the synergies between things that you know will interest somebody, particularly who is sort of firefighting in a service or is dealing with something. Then I think sometimes that enables people to sort of think, oh yes, I can see how that would fit in with what I want to do. I think the Ideas Fund projects are really useful in terms of the amazing things that they've done, connecting in between with each other in the projects, and then outside and wider that. They offer us really good case studies of how we can do this work and how you can do things differently. So as they've moved, particularly some of them, into their sort of second phase, they've started to engage much more with public engagement and going into sort of the school system or whatever system to take their learning into a different space, which will enable them to sort of maximize the conversations about doing things in different ways, really, I think. But time, trust and relationships, I think are the sort of key to being a weaver, and holding it all in your head as well about who you can connect to what. And we do spend a lot of our time doing that, facilitating that process. And more and more people are coming to us, say, do you know somebody who? And, you know, being able to broker, you know, be a broker as well as a sort of facilitator and weaver and agent of change and all those sorts of things.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, so much in what you both said about creating these spaces and needing the time. And also, I think there's a question in the chat as well about how do we value these roles? We know they are so valuable, they make so much difference. They are the things that create those conditions for the long term. And I guess that's what the Ideas Fund today is partly about. How do we start to raise the visibility of this work and make the case for it, get more funding and resource into it? So my next question, I think you both talked a bit about straddling the current world as it exists, but also trying to reimagine the future. And, you know, Katie, I know you're working with the ICB and health systems, while at the same time you're trying to reimagine a very different future and make some fundamental shifts. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of how it's been working with statutory partners and how you're trying to hold that balance between the current but also reimagining the future.
So I think there are kind of two things for me. One is finding the people who kind of believe in this stuff within the system, and using those people because they have leverage within their own kind of bits of the system and power and so on, and helping to bring them on board as kind of champions and advocates for the work. And we're really fortunate. Our ICB, we work with a couple of incredible colleagues, one who leads on the research front and one who's very heavily involved in their community-based work. And they've just been really, really helpful at constantly kind of championing this work and thinking not just about how you can fund an individual project, but how you can kind of hardwire these approaches within existing systems. And I think one of the things that was amazing that came up recently was one of the ICB colleagues talking about their sort of project sign-off process, which is very dry on the whole, but typically requires your financial summary and to show that you've thought about the human resources implications and so on. And they'd sort of created a new version of this where they had to show that they had gone about seeking community input, what their community data and insight was telling them, and that was now part of, integrated care boards, horrible acronyms, just seen that in the chat, but they'd actually kind of hardwired that into their system and their process. So I think having champions and then them thinking about how they can sort of help us to navigate those bits of the system have been really helpful. And then the other bit I think is about bringing to the forefront the sort of green shoots of the sort of hopeful practice that's emerging and using that to kind of get people inspired and excited and so on. And there is some really sort of incredible stuff going on in Norfolk that I think when you tell system partners about it, they get really, really excited and they want more of it. So a really good example of a project that's part of the Community Knowledge Fund, which is the kind of sister projects of the Community Research Network funded by UKRI, a project led by a social enterprise called the Shoebox, which is based in Norwich. And they have a community connector programme where they recruit and support people with lived experience from 3 estates in Norwich, to go out and have just very open conversations with people in the area about their lives and what's important to them. And they're working with Norwich City Council to sort of do analysis around the data and what that's telling them and what that means for policy and service design. But it's a really sort of exciting example of reframing lived experience as an asset and something that's really valuable for employment, rather than seeing it as a sort of something you extract and put in some research. So yeah, nurturing the green shoots is, I think, another really important part of playing the role within the system.
Thanks, Katie. Those practical examples of the hardwiring the green shoots are so helpful. And I mentioned ICB first, so that's why I spelled it out. Try not to get stuck in the acronyms. Jill and Kate, I mean, what strikes me is that idea of green shoots really plays into that two loops model that you mentioned. Do you want to say a little bit more about how you straddle between the current world, the reimagining the future, and any practical examples where you've made progress?
Yeah, I think it'd be good if Kate says a little bit more about that. I think one of the barriers is that people often tinker with what we have because they can't think beyond what we have, which then restricts people. So it's the tools and techniques that you need to be able to get people to start beyond that. So I think the Town Anywhere will be something that will enable people to do that, because you're starting with where you want to be and then look back, rather than thinking where do you want to go and see the barriers. If you start where you want to be, you can look back and see how you've sort of overcome those aspects, really. I think yeah, do you want to say a bit more about the loops, Kate? I think that would be
I mean, just, yeah, so, in terms of the loop, yeah, okay. Well, I guess this is the thing around the systems that we have in place. If you're just looking at like the things that do things to people and everything, I think we have to acknowledge that they're broken. So doing more of the same, it's like that Buckminster Fuller quote is like doing I can't remember what it is, doing more of the same, using the same methods that you did before. It's like the definition of madness or whatever. So and it's incredibly challenging to sort of like shift out of that. So it's where is that we work with artists and creative practitioners as well. It's like how can we enable more creativity into this process as well, to enable us to imagine. And actually time travel's it's a very exciting thing that brings results there as well. But I think with the two loops theory, the point of that is that I feel so strongly very often when we're within organizations with that duty of care and everything, it's like this thing, oh God, we've got to solve all of these things. Often these answers in the communities already. So we often hear about like how we need to I don't know, build capacity and stuff like that. But it's like I think the biggest shift is within the sort of the people that hold that power right now. And I think the challenge with navigating this as the sort of broker or weaver in that context is that shift in sort of thinking. So it's like if you're in a place that you have power, you don't see it. So very often language becomes commodified, and like co-production and everything, and it's more of the same ultimately. So that can be quite tricky, being within a process where there's extraction going on and naming that. So yeah, but that's also really exciting. So there's something, with the two loops, it's like this is a dying thing. So it's like finding the pioneers, that the people are doing stuff, joining it together, and then the relationship part of that is a really important thing to enable us to share it. Because if we're looking at our dominant system, the way projects are funded as well, everything is designed for us to compete with each other. So these spaces for relationship and connection and intersection, the whole point of this is maybe we can start to overcome this overwhelm that we have of like so much to do by becoming more than the sum of our parts, by creating these spaces. So I think it's quite a big job, and you need to do something pretty radical and fun, such as the Town Anywhere process, to enable you to like travel to the future and link from here to actually what our heart's yearning for, what is a good life ultimately, and why are we doing this. It's like second order change.
Thanks so much both. And the answers are in the communities already. It's those at hold power who need to shift behaviours and resource flows and everything else. And I guess that's what the Ideas Fund is trying to do in shifting who holds the power in the university community relationship. Now I wanted to move a little bit to the practicalities. So we've talked a lot about ways of working, and we've also talked about the fact that this way of working is emergent. You need to be more comfortable with the unknowns and not having really structured processes. But we've also talked about the fact that, there's a lot of theory around all this stuff. So I was just wondering, like, what do you do to help make these approaches and spaces inclusive? And also, how do you look out for people's well-being when this can be a very overwhelming, sometimes these can be pretty overwhelming questions to open up. Jill, I might come to you first.
Yeah, big question. I think it can be overwhelming for people to think about how we do things and how we can make spaces inclusive and change. Because it is something different when you've got so many other things to juggle, that you are thinking, how have I got the time to actually put into doing this thing different? And that it can raise lots of issues for people. As you say, the well-being, holding well-being is really important for people, because people are giving of themselves, they're giving of their stories, because a lot of this focus is really on storytelling and around what people think and feel, their past, the history, the context and the future. So I think it's quite complex, and it is easy for us to sort of think theoretically about how we might do this, but in practice it is going back to some of the sort of points we've already made, really having those safe spaces for people to come into, to feel that they are able to say whatever it is that they want to say, and that might not always be sort of in agreement with other people. So it's about enabling people to have constructive conflict sometimes, to be able to move forward, because we don't really get change unless we start to address some of these major issues with people. But we do have to ensure that people feel safe within that space. So that's about the building relationships and trust. If people trust you, then they're more likely to open up, and that again goes back to time, because you can't build trust and relationships without time. So a lot of this is circular, really, I think, but I think it's the tools that you use, the approaches. There are lots of different ways of doing things with people, but thinking them through thoughtfully to see what you want people to do within that space, within that task, which won't put them in any sort of vulnerable situation, but will enable them to open up, I think is really important. So the different techniques, I think, are crucial within that space, but also not really doing things on your own. I think you need to be part of a team, because you know, there's always needs to be people to support anybody who might get upset, you know, and to ensure that their well-being is taken care of. So yeah, lots of different dimensions as usual to all of this, that which draws on the conversations that we've been having.
Thanks so much, Jill. And it also strikes me that your well-being is so important of this, and having people to draw on, because you were holding so much in the roles you're playing, connecting with the system. So just briefly, before we move on to the audience Q&A, Katie, Jill, building on what Jill said, are there any just small examples of approaches, practices, tools you've used that you found have worked well in creating these spaces that help people engage in these conversations?
So my things aren't very, you know, I don't know whether I describe them as a tool. I think it's just really kind of everyday things. So I guess for us, we go to where the community is rather than expecting them to come to our space. So we're invited into their space, and they're the ones who within that space are, you know, comfortable, they're familiar and so on, and we're invited in to participate with them. I think we think a lot about language and talking in a way that's as straightforward, you know, is straightforward for everyone. We take a lot of advice from our community partners who work with people in that community day in, day out. So we try to come with as few assumptions as we possibly can about what's right, the best way to work with them. We hear our community partners, and we respond to what they tell us. So, for example, in Norfolk, quite a challenge is around levels of literacy. So we bear that in mind. If we're going to work in a community organisation where that's a challenge for some people who are volunteering on the project, then we change our approach accordingly, and we do things in a different way that's going to work for everyone. We use food as an icebreaker. I just think getting around a table in a nice, relaxed environment and eating some nice food together, it's just like a really good way, a really good leveler, and a really good way of breaking the ice. So nothing that would blow anyone's minds, but I think sometimes it's just those really small practical things that just put everyone at ease and enable people to work constructively together.
Yeah, hospitality is a big thing, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. And Kate, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of hosting, isn't it? For sure. I was thinking, it's so often, it's like when it's like these emergent spaces, there's a thing that the idea that it isn't structured, and I always think of the sort of scaffolding around it, and that there's also something important about understanding people's drivers for being there, and what is the invitation to people as well. So, you know, at times of overwhelm, it's like, I think that is actually about individual conversations with people to enable them to come in. All the stuff we talked about, that sort of building relationships. There's a sentence that I use a lot that comes from another process, a sort of governance process, but it's like, tension is wisdom waiting to express itself. So it's like, if you have an understanding of people's drivers for being there, understand the drivers of why you're together and everything, you can make decisions based on that. But also, like, creating that safe space to name the tensions if there's a tension, because wisdom comes out and it moves you forward as well. So I do think there's when you look at how maybe we've got better at this sort of stuff, but when you look at sort of traditional ways that meetings are held, it's you often have it's like where the person who can get in speaks the most. So I do think there's really something around circles and actually instruction and exercises around deep listening. So with our Poverty Truth Commission, for example, we mirrored the process of relationship building with our community commissioners, with the civic commissioners as well. And that sort of human connection by sharing stuff about yourself is a really good leveler as well, that enables you to sort of create that equitable space and actually get down to doing the business.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so much of this is just about human relationships and being in relationship with each other well, but as you've said, it's not something that happens by accident. That scaffolding has to be so thoughtful and intentional. So thanks for exploring that for us. So in a moment we're going to open up to some questions from the audience. There's already been lots in the chat. I've had some of the comments from the survey being fed through. Please do continue adding to the survey if you haven't already. We will share the findings from that after this session. Before we move on to some audience Q&A, I just wanted to invite my colleague Sophia. She's been having a look at what's coming through the survey, particularly the questions you're interested in exploring. So Sophia, would you like to share a bit of what you've been seeing?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few themes that are coming through. One of them is about sort of learning and understanding impact. So how to measure impact of co-produced work, and also understanding what the long-term impact of systems change is, and then also how to use that with translating that externally. So when a growing visibility of the impact of that kind of work to generate more of that. There was also a few questions around sort of like roles and accountability, and with that, questions of ethics and care. So there was a question about capacity, which I'd imagine folks may be familiar with, which is how can meaningful action be built into the process of research, especially when researchers don't have the capacity to do this sort of work, or when this work kind of feels extra, I guess. There's also a question around the sort of hidden labor of this kind of work, and what's the role of consultants as knowledge holders within the risks of codification and standardization of knowledge away from community-based movements and meaningful work. The other main one was around engagement and power. There was a lot of questions around who should be involved in participation, engagement, and how, and considerations of power. So how to increase research efficiency with hard to reach populations, how to co-design evaluation approaches with communities, and then a few questions of accessibility. So questioning whose spaces and processes are designed to invite or to welcome. So there was a specific question around how do you make participation neuro-inclusive, and how do you know you're hearing authentic feedback from autistic children, for example. And then finally, there are a couple of questions around ethics processes. How can they be done well and involve communities? And then also, how are these learnings shared beyond sort of the action and the groups and the organizations you're working with? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sophia, and thanks everyone for all those questions. There's so much in there. I think we will come to the question of how you understand the impact of this work. That's always a question in these sessions. So to give you a heads up, we'll come back to that later. To start with, I wanted to pick up on the question of ethics, because I think that is so central to a lot of what we've been discussing. And I know that in Hull, this is something you've been particularly focusing on, the fact that traditional university ethics processes aren't necessarily the best way to try and promote ethical behaviour, and actually it can act as a barrier. Would you like to say a little bit about your ethics work and what's coming up there?
Yes. Well, it was really interesting because we started the Ideas Fund really fast. And so with the first round, we were told at the university that everybody needed to put in for the ethics process. But this is, of course, the academics, not the community as such. And at that point, really, it was just the academics involved in the ethics process. Our forms, if anybody's, there are some people from universities on here, they'll probably have similar lengthy forms that go into huge detail about all sorts of different aspects that perhaps are not necessarily the most appropriate. In the second round of the Ideas Fund, we had incubators, so it enabled us to have more of an inclusive process. So the communities got involved with the researchers, and of course, when they saw the forms, they were might be able to say horrified by some of the things that were on there. And I think what we sort of explored when we had some sessions, because we brought in a facilitator, having approached the University Ethics Committee and said, especially for knowledge exchange, which the Ideas Fund is, it's not traditional research, it's knowledge exchange. So we're valuing the lived and learnt experience. The ethics forms don't seem really fit for purpose. They have a real sort of push towards risk and being risk averse, I guess. And that's understandable to some extent, because we don't want to do any harm. And that's part of what the ethics process is about, not doing any harm. But actually the way that they're framed does have a sort of deficit view of the people that you're going to be engaging with. So we did some work with Research Innovation Office, and then we brought in a brilliant facilitator, Bentley Crudgington, I think, sorry. And he was a really great facilitator. Kate was there as well, so she'll attest to this. And we brought in community members as well as researchers from the Ideas Fund, but we also had some people from the different ethics committees in the university. And interestingly, more or less everybody said it wasn't fit for purpose. So what we set about doing was actually creating one we'd like to say we've made earlier for when we go back to sort of talk to the university about this. So we looked at what would be a process that would facilitate the conditions for empowerment, which would enable both parties to feel that they were in the process, that would make it dynamic and live, so that it's not a fixed thing, because often the ethics process is fixed. If you're working with participatory and needs-led co-production, co-creation, whatever terminology you want to use, then it should be focused on unfolding as the process goes on, rather than something that's set at the beginning. So a traditional research project might say, these are the questions, this is what we're going to do, we're going to do interviews, we're going to do this, this and this. But with the sorts of projects that we're working on, the whole point of the Ideas Fund was that you could apply for money to find out what people needed. So we didn't know. So when people were filling in the forms, they didn't really know what to put in the forms, because it would unfold with the community. So these are the sorts of elements that we're now exploring with the university, and the next sort of task really is to go back to them with the ideas that came out of the workshops that we did, to see how we can sort of influence the system as it is, hopefully change the system so that it is more accommodating. Because what we recognize is this is for any partner really, not necessarily just for community partners. If you're working together, then there's a level of co-ownership, and this involves also intellectual property rights and things like that. So there are lots of knotty issues, big knotty issues, and obviously there's legal processes, and so we have to sort of navigate all of those as well. But we had brilliant workshops that enabled us to think through what would be a much more enabling process, so that we're not using negative language about the deficits of the people that are going to be part of the research, that they're actually included in the process. And yeah, so I'll leave to that, because I could waffle on for ages about that, because it's been really important piece of work.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. That is so helpful. I guess reflecting what Katie said earlier about taking an asset-based approach, there's so much to do there to change traditional university processes. And Katie, I wondered briefly, was there anything you wanted to come in on in terms of ethics, but also that idea of how do we remain accountable to communities as we do this work?
So in terms of ethics, I think we're much earlier in our sort of ethics discovery journey than it sounds like Jill and Kate are. So really, I just want details of your facilitator, because he sounds amazing. Then it'd be really helpful, because that's one of the things we want to think about as we go into the next 6 months of the work. I think in terms of accountability to communities, one of the things that has always troubled me about this kind of work is where you go into a community, you kind of extract their lived experience, and then off you go, and they never see anything happen as a result. And I suppose what we've tried to do with the research we've done with the feed and shrublands is very quickly move from insight into action in a very visible way that is tangible to the people who have been involved in that research. So none of this is kind of, like global cancer trial. These are small scale but incredibly important pieces of work that are really meaningful for the people who are participating in them. So we haven't taken a kind of academic process, but what we've done is we focused on things that are important to them. So they chose the topic they wanted to research, and they worked with some support to design the process and carry out the research and pull together the insights. And then the organizations took that, and so in the example of the feeds, they used what they heard to actually reshape their strategy. And their strategy is now a very asset-based approach, where previously that hadn't been the case. For shrublands, they heard what was important to people within that community centre, what maybe needed to change, and quickly moved to make change happen. So I think we've been accountable by showing that it is possible to have effective feedback loops, and it is possible to move from insight into action without it having to take years, potentially, which I think it can do elsewhere in the system.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing, I think that's really important, because it's about trusting communities as well, because they have safeguarding policies, they have a lot of things in place themselves. And the other point that you said about extraction is something that I've sort of been really I suppose contained with for a long time, because having worked in the voluntary sector before the university, when we've had researchers come in to talk to people about their mental health, their stories, they went away with it. We never heard anything again. So it's always been a really sort of passionate thing for me, that we don't extract, that it's an interactive process, that it's very much wound up with a joint process, I think, which is asset based, as you say. Yeah.
Thanks so much, both. So now I might come to the question of impact. I know what is often so hard in this work is it's so easy to see in your day-to-day role the impact this kind of work is having, that connecting, that weaving, the creating these different kind of spaces, the potential it unlocks. But this isn't how traditional funding works. This isn't the things that traditional ways of working reward. So Kate, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on terms of demonstrating impact and showing the value of this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really a big part of the sort of next step, this next stage in the process, really, to explore that, because again, impact, it doesn't always happen immediately, does it? It's not something that we've been doing in Hull. We did as in the build up to our showcase, was bringing the different projects together to look at the timeline of their relationship and what happened, which in itself was an amazing thing, because then they all the projects shared it with each other. But it's like, it feels like it's that bigger impact, it's something that's down the line, and that is the sort of hot question, like how we actually do that in a sort of this is a whole thing about doing things in a different way, isn't it? Where we're like moving beyond outputs and outcomes. It's like how we sort of co-design what are the things that have made a difference. So again, I think it's still going to be, that's going to be around conversations and relationships as well. And I think what we were doing as part of those processes were mapping the connections as well and the ripples. So there's something in creating these other spaces of how people connect, are curious about each other, and are learning from each other. It's like, what comes as a result of that? What other projects emerge out of that? How are people connecting across different arenas? So we talk about moving beyond silos to actually be doing something different, with sharing the sort of understanding from each of those places as well. Yeah, so I'd say that's emergent. It's emerging, but it's not immediate. So it's really important to look that over the long term. If we're looking at this whole system, you can't look at that in boxes.
Thanks so much, Kate. Yeah, some useful tips in there. Mapping connections and the ripple effects that come from it. And I know there's like evaluation techniques that are about ripple effect mapping, and yes, just starting to draw attention to those underlying conditions that you can tell are building the relationships, the trust that weren't there before, the potential, the ideas that is starting to get unlocked. And also, like, so much of it is experiential. And I think what's great about the Ideas Fund is development coordinators, BSA staff are actually there and experiencing the work. So I think, yeah, there's also a role for us to shift very transactional reporting requirements and actually be in this kind of work together.
I just add one other thing. It's like, I think it's going to be really interesting with actual researchers and academics, how this process of like it shifts like perspectives on sort of focus of what people are doing going forward. I think that's really exciting to explore.
Can I just add one thing, because I really have to go, I'm sorry, I've got to teach, but I think hearing the stories when we were working with the connections and the sort of ripples, particularly around how the people, the researchers and the practitioners have changed. And we've got a number of our academics who stood up and said, you know, this has changed my whole way of working. And so those are the sorts of things that have been really important for us within the university to be able to demonstrate to others that this works. You know, we can take a risk, we can do things differently. And as such, we are hoping for a little micro grants fund within the university to be able to build more of these sorts of projects, so that, yes, hearing people say this has changed the way I do things. And yeah, we have got quite a few people who've said that, and their practices externally as well.
Right.
So I'm really sorry I have to leave, but it's been brilliant. And I think we should need to have a follow-up, because there's still too much to talk about.
Thanks so much, Jill. Yeah, loads of questions still to come, and yeah, I'm sure we'll follow up on them. As a close to the Q&A, I wanted to come to you, Katie and Kate. For people starting out thinking about this work, what tips might you have for them? What are the things you wish you know now that you wish you'd known at the start of this kind of work? Katie, any thoughts from you?
That is a really good question. I think maybe a couple of things for me. One is just to be curious and just go and have lots and lots of conversations with people, and and you'll just learn so much from just connecting and finding out who's doing different things, what can you learn from them, what do they have to offer, what can you offer them, and starting to build those collaborations. I think as well, just thinking about just that this takes time, and you can't expect to shift a whole system in kind of 6 weeks or even 6 months, maybe even 6 years. I was at an event to do with the REND project that I mentioned at the start, and someone from NIHR was there, which is a huge kind of funding body, and they talked about how they really believed in this stuff, but it was like turning a tanker. And I thought that was a really good kind of visual representation of what it feels like sometimes. But it's just thinking every kind of ripple that you're creating through this work is helping to shift that tanker. So just kind of, yeah, be curious, invest time in the process. It's going to take a while, but it's really worth it. And the kind of more that you stimulate and kind of test and learn, the more likely you are to kind of shift that tanker.
Thanks so much, Katie. Really helpful tips. Kate, we've got about 1 minute left for any advice or wisdom that you want to share.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on like starting the work. I think it's just the way I think about things, but I would say my shift over time, it's like, you know, having previously worked in NHS in change management and developing systems that or services that have a positive impact on people and young people and their families. This is particularly around psychosis, and then seeing 20 years later that's going back to business as usual. My learning is like just doing it within that it's almost like a waste of time in some ways. That this has to be the way forward, how we bridge those sort of intersection things. As human beings, we do not exist in silos of like labels or whatever. We are whole systems in ourselves within a bigger system. So I wish I'd known that.
Really good point, Kate. And so much today is about keep it human. And also what's really striking me is the value of connecting people doing this kind of work, so we can support each other, so we can raise the profile, we can value it even more. Thank you so much, Jill, who's left, but also to you, Kate and Katie. That was so interesting, and I think hopefully well, we didn't get to all the audience questions, hopefully it's given people some real food for thought and some real practical examples of what this work can look and feel like. So at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Kirsty to close.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, just to say really a massive thanks to Ellen, Dawn and Sophia from Collaborate for their chairing, facilitation, pulling out of the questions. That was some wizardry in the background there. And of course, many thanks to Jill, Kate and Katie for sharing so many good insights and experiences within this work. I think you've left us all with a lot to follow up on. And a final thanks to my colleague Jill as well for doing a lot of organising for this conversation and other learning events in the background as well. So for us, there will be a lot of other further opportunities. We really like that, to share our learning from Ideas Fund and from other people thinking about these things and working on lots of different areas as well. So we're going to be doing lots more blogs and future learning events and conversations as well. Really importantly, we're really keen to hear from you about what you would like, what you'd like to hear from us, what you might want to collaborate on or get involved in as well. I think Jill's going to put our email address for the Ideas Fund in the chat. Yeah, really keen to keep conversations going. And for this one, if there's opportunities to connect or you really want to follow something up, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So thanks again, and hope you all have a great afternoon. Bye.